Welcome to Music to My Ears. My name is John Lowry. I'm here with 5 of my colleagues from the Calgary Philharmonic, and we're going to explore Beethoven's 7th Symphony, which was described by Richard Wagner as the apotheosis of dance. This is the first time that any of us have played together since the 12th of March earlier this year because of the pandemic. We have been taking all precautions. You see, we're all 2 meters apart here. And this is the first time we're playing together. We thought that the Allegretto from the 7th Symphony would be a good choice for this occasion.
Yeah, so that's 6 feet.
Now, the 7th Symphony was completed in 1812, which was 4 years after the Pastoral Symphony, which was the 6th. The years from 1810 to 1815 were quite difficult years for Beethoven. On one hand, he was becoming really famous. He had already composed many of his great works, which were accepted quite well in Vienna and more throughout Europe. But he was now in his early 40s. He was no longer the brash young piano virtuoso who took Vienna by storm in the previous decade. Early 40s was older in those days than it is now. His deafness had probably begun around 1800. It was developing to the point that it was very difficult for him to converse with people and to hear music. He was very rarely able to perform as a pianist anymore. Now, Beethoven was never very easy socially to begin with, and as he became less able to communicate, he drew into himself, and his communication always led to misunderstandings and bad feelings. During these years, he had several serious romantic failures and disappointments. And this led him often to a deep depression during these years, and possibly alcohol abuse. Plus, he always never had great health to begin with. He always had some kind of ailment or sickness and was often unable to work. Now, as far as his romantic life was concerned, he always went after the wrong sort of women, either way too young, like he was in his 40s and he would try to court a 17-year-old, or else it would be a woman of the nobility who it was really impossible for him to be with. So I think we've all been there trying to court the wrong woman, right? And he was also in these years, there was a certain creative trouble. He was never wanting to repeat himself. He was sort of coming out of his period 2 compositions, but trying to find his way into his late style. He also had a lot of money troubles. Since he could no longer perform, a lot of his income had come from performing, actually. During these years, he was offered a position in Cassel by Napoleon's brother, Jerome Bonaparte. But he decided not to take the position, and instead he tried to convince 3 noblemen from Vienna, Kinsky, Archduke Rudolf, and Lobkowitz, to pay him an annuity, to pay him a certain amount every year, and in return he would agree to stay in Vienna. He actually signed a contract with them, but one of them especially was very bad at paying him, so he was always waiting for money. And he was actually always in the law courts trying to get money. And so he was so worried about money all the time that was a big issue for him. Now, in those days, there were no professional orchestras really in Vienna. So when Beethoven wanted his works performed, he would have to organize a concert himself, which was very difficult. He had to find all the musicians and either persuade them to play or have money to pay them. And so many times there were not enough rehearsals, and these concerts were a problem. Now there was a man called Johann Nepomuk Malzel who invented a fantastical mechanical instrument which was called the panharmonicon. And he persuaded Beethoven to compose a very large-scale popular work depicting Wellington's victory over Napoleon. And this was for large orchestra and panharmonicon. Beethoven really needed the money, so he agreed to do this. Now, there was a concert in December 1813, which included this Wellington's victory and also the Seventh Symphony. Wellington's victory was like an ancestor of the 1812 overture of Tchaikovsky. There was a tradition of refighting recent and contemporary battles in the concert hall. In this music, Rural Britannia was the theme for the British, and Malbrook for the French, and there were all kinds of clashes of trumpets and percussions, mechanical noises and explosions. At this concert, a who's who of famous musicians participated. The great double bass virtuoso Domenico Dragonetti. Schuppanzig was the concertmaster who was the leader for all the quartets that Beethoven wrote. Ludwig Spohr in the violin section. The famous composers Salieri and Hummel played the big drums that were supposed to be cannons. And Meyerbeer, the opera composer, was on bass drum. The public went crazy for this piece and also received the Seventh very well. In fact, this concert was one of the best and most triumphant moments of Beethoven's life. The orchestra was fiery and inspired. Beethoven himself conducted in inimitable style. He was very famous for very awkward moves, and he couldn't hear the orchestra. And the Allegretto was repeated many times. This concert had to be repeated 4 days later. The Seventh Symphony went on to become one of Beethoven's most popular works. Now, there were no recordings there, but there was a huge appetite for learning the music, and so there were many different kinds of arrangements for two pianos, for quartets, for woodwinds. And what you're going to hear us play today is a version for string quintet to which we've added Graeme on bass. This is an arrangement found by Stephanie, and it was actually published in 1816. And there's no name on the arrangement. We don't know if Beethoven himself made this arrangement, but it's an intriguing possibility. It's not impossible.
Thank you for that, John. That was fantastic. The Joyous Seventh, or as Beethoven would have said, his most excellent symphony, is my favorite of all Beethoven's symphonies. It is full of dance and celebration. Each movement has a different character of dance in its rhythm. It is rich melodically, very pleasing to listen to, and from my perspective of a second violinist, a lot of fun to play. Beethoven's Seventh Symphony is special to me in that it was the first symphony I ever learned in my impressionable teenage years. I grew up playing in the Calgary Youth Orchestra, and the 1979-1980 season was devoted to Beethoven's Seventh. We recorded the symphony live before a full house at the Jubilee Auditorium. We made an LP. And the performance was dedicated to the commemoration of Alberta's 75th anniversary in 1980. It was a special event for a special anniversary in Alberta. Later that season, we toured to England, visiting and performing at Brighton's Royal Pavilion in the Royal Albert Hall for the opening night of the Proms in London. This valuable youth orchestra experience clearly left an imprint of fond memories for me, and hence the beginning of my relationship to the symphonic world. 40 years later, I don't know how many times I've actually played Beethoven's Seventh in my career, but what I do know is that today was the very first time I've played Beethoven's Seventh as a string sextet. The 2020 pandemic has given me some extra time to reflect on my favorite movement, the Allegretto. I think it's one of Beethoven's finest and most expressive movements and highlights the string section at its best. Although the movement opens with a somber-like funeral march in the key of A minor, it's amazing how Beethoven can develop and spin out one of the most beautiful and lyrical melodies, now in the key of A major, giving us a sense of optimism and hope and promise of better times. The movement culminates with a fugue before ending sadly again in the key of A minor. For me, the Allegretto is some of the most exquisite, stay-at-home, quarantine listening music. Beethoven's Seventh, a very accessible symphony for anyone to listen to and to play, as John mentioned, was a big hit in his day with calls for repeated performances over and over again, especially of the beautiful Allegretto movement. Even to this day, the Allegretto retains its popularity as it has been featured in many major films, including from the mid-90s, Immortal Beloved, Mr. Holland's Opus, and the turn of the century, some of my favorites, The Fall in 2007, with some amazing slow motion, black and white cinematography at the beginning of the film, will sure leave an impression. And the most powerful, The King's Speech in 2010, when Colin Firth, as King George VI, gives his last speech with his debilitating stutter. It is perfectly paced with the timing of the Allegretto. It is obvious that Beethoven's music will continue to be honored and influence all of us, whether it's with a film score at the movie theater or with a rousing symphony performance at the concert hall.
I just wanted to say that for me, this was a real honor. This caps my career. It's the last thing I'll play as an actual CPO member, and it's kind of fitting. We were supposed to actually finish with Beethoven 5 last concert of this year, and which would have been fantastic because my parents had one of those old, I think it's called an 8-track thing where it's only got like 4 tracks on each side and you have to flip it over and you have to listen. Anyway, they had a recording of Beethoven 5 and Beethoven 8. And there's a moment at the end of Beethoven 8, and I'm a Led Zepp fan, so why I was listening to Beethoven, I have no idea. But I put this thing in, and there's this moment in the last movement just before the end, and the basses and cellos just come soaring out of the bottom of the orchestra after all this sort of craziness, and it's just that dee 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 da 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 dum, and it, for some weird reason, just hit a bone with me, and it was I was like, that is the coolest sound. And when I started taking up an instrument in school, it was like obviously going to be cello or bass, and here I am finishing kind of a nice bookend, finishing with, like Stephanie said, if I were told I could have one movement to take away with me to a desert island out of all of Beethoven's works, this slow movement in the Seventh would definitely be it.
Recently, I got to play this piece for the first time as my first piece with you guys when I joined in September, and now we're doing it at the end of the season, but in a very different way. So for me, this is very unique to sort of explore the symphonic sound just with strings and not having any winds here or brass or anything else. So it's been a unique experience for us in that way. There are times where my part, there's 2 violas in this arrangement, but there are some times where I'm to be playing the oboe line or the bassoon line or clarinet line. So it's interesting to sort of get into the minds of the wind players and, you know, imagine that we're making sort of similar, tones or qualities of sound or colors. So for me, it was challenging to sort of explore what it means to play the viola like an oboist or, like a clarinetist or what have you. And I think it's been a really fantastic challenge, in the midst of everything that's going on. It's great to have a project like this and really just focus on making music with these guys and putting something together in a very different different way. And yeah, if I can say anything else, I'm just very, very grateful to have gotten out of my cave and play some music with you guys. And yeah, this has been a really, really fun project for me.
I think we all have these pieces, especially musicians, that we remember very vividly listening to for the first time. I know Graeme already mentioned how important this movement was to him, and it's the same thing for me. I vividly remember sitting in my living room in front of this CD boombox. My parents had bought the complete Beethoven Symphony set played by the Berlin Phil. I was around 12 years old at the time, and I by that point I knew I wanted to go into music, and so I knew that I had to start appreciating Beethoven symphonies, because all my teachers and mentors were telling me, you have to start listening to Beethoven symphonies if you want to understand Beethoven. So I sat down one day. I was determined to go through all the symphonies and listen to them. Of course, I didn't have patience back then, so I would only listen to the first a few minutes of each movement. When I got to the Seventh Symphony, I remember I listened to the first movement for a few minutes, fast forward, and then go to the next movement. I got to the second movement, and after that opening chord, there was this very simple line that goes on, and I was just I had my finger over like the next track, but I was like, I stopped myself, and I was like, oh, where's this gonna go? Because it was just so simple, and I was wondering where he was gonna take this. And I remember just sitting there, and there's that gradual crescendo, and more instruments start coming in, and once you hit that, once everybody joins in, the timpani and all the woodwinds, and there's this big climax in the phrase. And I remember just feel this strange feeling, like my eyes started watering, and my head just was just like leaning back, and it was the first time I kind of had that experience listening to music. And at 12 years old, the thing that I remember relating it to is like, going on the initial rise of a roller coaster, and once the first drop happens, and you just get that rush, and for me it was just like riding a roller coaster. I wanted to ride it over and over again. So after the movement was over, I kept going back, and I listened to it maybe 5 times in a row. It just blew my mind. So now I know why I felt that way, because it's just one of the greatest works of music in the history of the world. But at the moment, it just really moved me in a way that I knew that this is what I wanted to do with my life, is be a musician.
The whole symphony is in A major, and this movement is in A minor. So it shares the same tonic as the rest of the piece. It's the structure is loosely a double variation. It's got an A-B-A-B-A form. So there's kind of 2 sets of material. There's the theme we hear initially, this very dark, melancholic kind of theme that Beethoven expands on, and in that first A section, he repeats it 3 different times, and each time, as Arnold mentioned, it's growing, and it reaches this climax early on that's extremely powerful. And once we get to the top of that, Beethoven then kind of lets it unfold, and it transitions into this very contrasting, beautiful B section, which is in A major. That is a completely different feeling. It shares the same tempo, it shares the same pacing, yet the music is entirely different. And part of that is because this very rhythmic kind of Morse code almost, like long, short, short, long, long. That rhythm that is in the initial A section, it's replaced with this kind of like flowing triplet-y feel that the violins have in this B section. So we have this A, this B, and then the A comes back again. And this time, Beethoven reintroduces that theme, but he adds a fugue as well. So it's even more material that is now passed around through the instruments. And then once the fugue is complete, there's another repetition of the main theme, and it transitions back into another repetition of the B section, only it's a little shorter. It's condensed a little bit, and then there's another short A section, which kind of acts like a coda. And the difference at the end is that throughout those first 4 sections, every time you hear the main melody, it's played by one instrument. So each repetition, it begins with the violas, then the violins. Each time that's played in its entirety by one instrument. And at the very end, it's the feeling is that things have fallen apart and there's hopelessness. He creates this extremely well in that he's passing that around, and it's going from one person to one person. It's not played by one instrument. And you're left with this kind of hopelessness. Maybe not the most uplifting choice we made for a time like this, but I think Beethoven was really a master at going into those dark places and being able to communicate what that feeling is. And for a lot of people that we're able to find that feeling that we experience in life, and we find it in music. And somehow it sometimes eases that pain that we feel by knowing that someone else is able to feel it as well and communicate it in such an amazing way.